The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle. Not the gentle kind that makes everything look romantic in movies, but the annoying drizzle that gets you wet no matter how fast you walk. David was already running late for his meeting with a new client, and the last thing he needed was traffic. He was a graphic designer. Nothing fancy, just a regular guy trying to make a living doing what he loved. At 34, he had a small apartment, a beat-up Honda that needed new tires and enough freelance work to pay his bills with a little left over. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his, and he was grateful for it. As he rushed down Fifth Avenue, dodging puddles and other hurried pedestrians, something made him slow down. Maybe it was the sound, a soft crying that somehow cut through the noise of the city. He looked around and spotted her near a parked car, an older woman who looked to be in her 70s, maybe older. She was standing in the rain without an umbrella and her shoulders were shaking. David's first instinct was to keep walking. He was already late, and Seattle had plenty of people who could help. Besides, getting involved in other people's problems wasn't always a good idea. But something about the way she stood there, so small and defeated, made him stop. He walked over slowly, not wanting to startle her. That's when he saw it. A bright orange parking ticket tucked under her windshield wiper, getting soaked by the rain. The woman was holding a small coin purse, the kind his grandmother used to carry, and she was counting change with trembling fingers. Quarters, dimes, nickels. Her hands shook so badly that she kept dropping the coins onto the wet pavement. "Excuse me," David said gently. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, and he could see the tears mixing with the rain on her face. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired. This was the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting too long and was running out of strength. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine. I can't afford this ticket. I was at the hospital and I lost track of time, and now—" Her voice trailed off as more tears came. David felt something twist in his chest. He'd never been wealthy, but he'd also never been in a position where a parking ticket could break him. He looked at the ticket. $65. That was 2 days of groceries for him, maybe 3 if he was careful. But something in the woman's face told him it might as well have been $6,000 to her. "Let me take care of it," he heard himself say before he could think too hard about it. The woman's eyes went wide. No, I couldn't possibly. You don't even know me." "That's okay," David said, and he meant it. Consider it a gift from a stranger who hoped someone would do the same for him if he needed it. He pulled out his phone and quickly paid the ticket online before she could protest further. The whole transaction took maybe 2 minutes, but it felt longer. When he was done, he showed her the confirmation on his screen. The woman stared at the phone, then at him, and then she did something unexpected. She grabbed his hand with both of hers. Her hands were cold and thin, the skin soft like paper, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "You have no idea what you've just done for me," she said, and there was something in her voice that made David pay attention. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. Relief, maybe, or hope. "What's your name?" David Chen." "David," she repeated like she was memorizing it. "I'm Helen, and I promise you I will never forget this kindness." She reached into her old coat pocket and pulled out a pen. David noticed the coat was worn at the cuffs and had a small tear near the collar that someone had tried to mend. Helen took his hand and gently wrote her phone number on his palm. The ink smeared a little from the rain. "Please," she said, "I want to pay you back. Give me your address or your number, anything." "I can't just take this from you." David felt awkward. He hadn't done it for repayment. The whole point was to help someone who needed it. But Helen looked so earnest, so insistent, that he didn't want to hurt her pride by refusing completely. "Tell you what," he said, fishing a slightly damp business card from his wallet. "Here's my card, but honestly, you don't owe me anything. Just pass it forward someday when you can help someone else." Helen took the card carefully, holding it like it was made of gold. She studied it for a long moment, running her finger over the embossed letters of his name. Then she tucked it safely into her purse. "Thank you, David," she said again. "You're a good person. The world needs more people like you." David felt embarrassed by the praise. He hadn't done anything special, not really. It was just $65. But Helen looked at him like he'd given her the moon and stars. They said goodbye, and David watched as Helen carefully got into her old sedan. The car had to be at least 20 years old, with rust spots on the door and a cracked taillight. She gave him a little wave before pulling away from the curb. David stood there for a moment in the rain, watching her car disappear into traffic. He looked down at his palm where she'd written her number, already fading from the moisture. Something about the encounter felt significant, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the intensity in her eyes or the way she'd held his hand, or just the strange feeling that something important had just happened. Then his phone buzzed. His client. He was now 15 minutes late. Shoot, David muttered, and took off running toward the office building 3 blocks away. By the time he got to the meeting, apologized for being late and dove into talking about design concepts and brand identity, the encounter with Helen had already started to fade from his mind. It became just another moment in another busy day. He didn't think about the business card she'd taken, or the promise in her eyes, or the way she'd said his name like she was committing it to memory. He had no idea that his entire life was about to change. That $65 would turn into something he never could have imagined. That the defeated old woman crying in the rain was about to give him the greatest gift he'd ever received. But that day, walking out of his meeting 3 hours later, David Chen was just glad he'd helped someone. And for him, that was enough. 3 weeks went by, and David had completely forgotten about the parking ticket incident. Life had a way of doing that, pulling you forward into the next thing and the next until yesterday's moments became fuzzy memories. He'd been busy with work, pulling late nights on a logo redesign for a coffee company, and dealing with a difficult client who changed their mind every other day. His girlfriend Jennifer had been patient about all the canceled dinner plans, but he could tell she was getting tired of coming second to his laptop. It was a Friday afternoon when everything changed. David had just gotten home from the gym, still sweaty and thinking about taking a shower when he checked his mailbox. Usually it was just bills and junk mail, the occasional menu from a restaurant he'd never order from. But today there was something different, a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind you'd use for a wedding invitation or something formal. His name and address were written in elegant handwriting, the kind nobody really used anymore. There was no return address, which struck him as odd, maybe even a little concerning. David carried it upstairs to his apartment, tossed his gym bag on the floor, and sat down at his small kitchen table. He turned the envelope over in his hands. It was heavy, expensive paper, the kind that probably cost more than the regular stuff at the drugstore. He opened it carefully, not wanting to rip whatever was inside. There were 2 things in the envelope. One was a letter, several pages long, written in the same elegant handwriting. The other was a smaller sealed envelope about the size of a greeting card. David unfolded the letter and started reading. "Dear David," it began. "You probably don't remember me. We met briefly 3 weeks ago on a rainy Tuesday morning. You paid my parking ticket when I was at my lowest point, and you asked for nothing in return." David's mind raced back. The parking ticket, the crying woman Helen, he'd honestly forgotten all about it. He kept reading. "I want you to know what that day meant to me. I had just come from the hospital where I'd finished my final round of chemotherapy. Final because the doctors told me there was nothing more they could do. I have stage 4 cancer, David, and I don't have much time left." David felt his stomach drop. He set the letter down for a moment, processing what he'd just read. That woman Helen, she'd been dying. She was probably still dying. And he'd had no idea. He picked the letter back up, his hands suddenly shaky. The parking ticket devastated me that morning, not because of the money itself, but because it felt like the final proof that I couldn't handle anything anymore. I'd spent everything I had on medical bills. I was living on a fixed income that barely covered my rent and food. That $65 might as well have been $600. I stood there in the rain, counting coins I didn't have, and I felt completely and utterly defeated. David remembered her trembling hands, the way the coins kept falling. He'd thought she was just upset about the ticket. He hadn't realized she was at the absolute end of her rope. Then you appeared, a stranger who owed me nothing, who was clearly in a hurry, who had every reason to keep walking, but you didn't. You stopped, you listened, and you helped me without hesitation or judgment. You gave me something more valuable than money that day, David. You gave me hope. You reminded me that there was still kindness in the world." David had to stop reading. His eyes were getting blurry. He wasn't usually the type to cry, but something about Helen's words was hitting him hard. He took a deep breath and continued. "After you left, I sat in my car and really looked at your business card. I went home and I looked you up online. I hope you don't think that's creepy, but I needed to know who you were. I found your website, saw your work, read about your volunteer work at the community center teaching design to kids. I learned that you're not wealthy. That $65 probably meant something to you too, and yet you gave it freely. David hadn't even thought about the money after that day. It was true that he wasn't rich, but $65 wasn't going to break him either. He'd just seen someone who needed help and helped them. Was that really so unusual? Apparently to Helen it was. I need to tell you something, David, and I hope you'll forgive me for not being entirely honest when we met. My full name is Helen Westbrook. My late husband was Gerald Westbrook. He founded Westbrook Software Solutions in 1983. Perhaps you've heard of it. David nearly dropped the letter. Westbrook Software Solutions. Of course he'd heard of it. Everyone in Seattle had heard of it. It was one of those quiet success stories, not as famous as Microsoft or Amazon, but hugely successful. They'd sold to a larger company back in the 90s for something like $200 million. And that was Helen, that elderly woman crying over a parking ticket. After Gerald died 5 years ago, I gave away most of our money. I funded scholarships, helped build a children's hospital wing, supported research for diseases that had no voice. I kept enough to live comfortably, or so I thought. But then I got sick, and medical bills have a way of eating through everything. I could have asked for help from friends or Gerald's former business partners, but pride is a funny thing. Instead, I let myself become that woman crying in the rain. David's mind was spinning. None of this made sense. Why was she telling him this? What did any of it have to do with a parking ticket? The enclosed envelope contains something important. But I need you to promise me something first. Do not open it alone. Inside are contact details for my attorney, Richard Sullivan. Call him, make an appointment. Open the envelope in his presence. I know this seems dramatic, but please trust me. This is important. The letter continued for another page, but David's eyes kept going back to that one line. Open the envelope in his presence. He picked up the smaller envelope. Shook it slightly. Something was inside, but he couldn't tell what. A key maybe? A check? His curiosity was killing him, but something about Helen's words made him take them seriously. The letter ended simply. Thank you, David, for your kindness. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for reminding me that good people still exist. I hope what I'm about to give you will help you continue being that person, and help many others along the way. With deepest gratitude and affection, Helen Westbrook. Below her signature was a phone number and an address for the attorney's office downtown. David sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the two envelopes, the letter, his own hands. His shower was forgotten. Everything was forgotten except the word swimming in his head. Helen Westbrook. Stage 4 cancer, attorney, don't open alone. What on earth was in that envelope? He picked up his phone and dialed the number. A professional voice answered on the second ring. Sullivan and Associates, how may I help you? Hi, David said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. My name is David Chen. I need to make an appointment with Richard Sullivan. It's about Helen Westbrook. There was a pause. Then the voice changed, became more attentive. Mr. Chen, we've been expecting your call. How soon can you come in? The law office was the kind of place that made David feel underdressed. He'd worn his best khakis and a button-up shirt, but walking through the glass doors into the marble lobby, he felt like he should have bought a suit. Sullivan and Associates occupied the entire 20th floor of a building downtown with a view of the water. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfect makeup and a kind smile, greeted him by name before he even introduced himself. Mr. Chen, please have a seat. Mr. Sullivan is finishing up a call. He'll be right with you. David sat on a leather chair that probably cost more than his car and tried not to fidget. He'd brought the sealed envelope with him, tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. He'd barely slept last night, his mind running through 100 different scenarios of what might be inside. Jennifer had wanted to come with him, but something told David this was something he needed to do alone. He hadn't even told her much about it. How do you explain that a dying woman you helped once was now involving lawyers and mysterious envelopes? Mr. Chen? David looked up. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway, tall and distinguished in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he had the kind of presence that came from decades of commanding courtrooms. I'm Richard Sullivan. Thank you for coming. Please follow me. David followed him down a hallway lined with oil paintings and into a corner office that was bigger than David's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of Elliott Bay. A massive wooden desk sat in the center, and a conference table occupied one side of the room. "Please, sit," Sullivan said, gesturing to the conference table. His voice was warm despite the formal setting. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm okay, thanks," David said, though his mouth felt like sandpaper. Sullivan sat across from him and folded his hands on the table. For a moment, he just looked at David with an expression that was hard to read, sad maybe, or thoughtful. "I'm very sorry to tell you this," Sullivan began, "but Helen Westbrook passed away 2 days ago, Monday evening, peacefully at home with hospice care." David felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He'd known she was sick, the letter had told him that, but somehow he'd hoped she'd have more time, that maybe he could see her again, thank her for whatever this was, tell her that she didn't need to do anything for him. "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "I barely knew her, but she seemed like a really special person." "She was," Sullivan agreed. "I handled the Westbrook family's legal matters for over 30 years. Helen was one of the finest people I've ever known. Generous to a fault, stubborn as they come, and absolutely brilliant at reading people." He paused, studying David's face. "She called me the day after she met you, said she'd found him. I asked her who, and she said the person she'd been looking for. At first I thought the medication was making her confused, but she was crystal clear. She'd been searching for someone specific, someone with a particular quality, and she found that person in you." David shifted uncomfortably. "I don't understand. I just paid a parking ticket. Did you bring the envelope?" Sullivan asked. David pulled it from his pocket and set it on the table. Sullivan picked it up, turned it over, then slid it back toward David. "Before you open it, I need to give you some context." "May I?" David nodded. Helen and Gerald Westbrook were worth approximately $200 million when Gerald sold his company. Over the years, they gave away most of it. Hospitals, schools, scholarships, medical research. They believed wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. When Gerald died, Helen continued their charitable work. But then she got sick. Sullivan stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Cancer treatment in America is expensive even when you have money. Helen refused to cut back on her charitable giving to pay for her care. She liquidated investments, sold properties, spent down her savings. By the time she met you, she was living on Social Security and a small pension. She had maybe $30,000 left to her name. "That's insane," David said. "Why wouldn't she just use her money to get better?" Sullivan turned back to him. "Because Helen believed that saving one life, her own, was less important than helping hundreds of others. I disagreed with her, argued with her, but she was determined. And in the end, the cancer was too aggressive. The money wouldn't have saved her anyway." He returned to his seat. "About 6 months before she met you, Helen came to me with an unusual request. She wanted to establish one final charitable foundation. She'd been setting aside money secretly, keeping it separate from her medical bills. $2 million. That was all she had left. She wanted it to go to helping people with unexpected financial emergencies, medical bills, car repairs, evictions, the kind of things that destroy lives not because they're huge but because they hit at exactly the wrong time." David's heart was starting to pound. Where was this going? But she didn't want just anyone running it. She wanted someone who understood kindness without expectation, someone who helped people because it was right, not because it would benefit them. She'd been searching for that person, attending community events, volunteering, watching, and then her time ran out. Sullivan leaned forward. "Until that Tuesday morning when she met you. She spent the entire afternoon researching you. Your work, your volunteer teaching, your life. She called me that evening and said she'd found the person. She spent her last 2 weeks on this earth working with me to set everything up. Now please, open the envelope." David's hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper folded once. He opened it and read. It was a letter of appointment. Official, legal, stamped and notarized, appointing David Chen as the executive director of the Westbrook Hope Foundation. Below that was a check, $50,000, made out to him personally. "I don't understand," David whispered. "The $50,000 is for you," Sullivan explained. Helen called it a thank you for being human. No strings attached. You can cash it, donate it, burn it, whatever you want. The foundation is something else entirely. $2 million in an account waiting. She's named you as the sole director. You would decide who gets help and how much. You'd have a small staff, an office, a salary of $90,000 a year. David couldn't breathe. This wasn't real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. She's giving me $2 million to give away? Yes. Why me? She met me for 5 minutes. Sullivan smiled, and for the first time, David saw real warmth in his professional demeanor. Because in those 5 minutes, you showed her who you were. You were late for something important. You were clearly not wealthy. You had every reason to keep walking, but you saw someone in pain and you helped them without thinking about what you'd get in return. Helen spent her whole life around wealthy people, David. Powerful people. Most of them were decent folks, but very few of them were genuinely kind when it cost them something. You were. David stared at the check. $50,000. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. And beyond that, a foundation, a purpose, a responsibility he never asked for. What if I'm not the right person for this? He asked quietly. Helen believed you were, and I've learned over 30 years that Helen Westbrook was rarely wrong about people. Sullivan slid a folder across the table. Take the weekend. Read through everything. The foundation details, the staff information, the mission statement. Then call me Monday and tell me your decision. But David, I hope you say yes. Because Helen's last wish was to turn your kindness into something that could help thousands of people. And I think that's beautiful. David left the office in a daze, the check and folder clutched in his hands, his entire world turned upside down by a woman he'd met for 5 minutes in the rain. David sat in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before he could even turn the key. His hands were still shaking. The folder sat on the passenger seat next to him, thick with documents and possibilities. The check was in his wallet, pressed between his driver's license and an old receipt, $50,000. $2 million foundation. Executive director, it felt like someone else's life, like he'd walked into the wrong movie. When he finally made it home, Jennifer was waiting on his couch. She'd let herself in with the spare key, and the smell of Chinese takeout filled the small apartment. One look at his face and she knew something big had happened. Babe, you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened? David sat down heavily beside her and told her everything. The letter, Helen's death, the attorney's office, the foundation. Jennifer listened without interrupting, her eyes getting wider with every sentence. When he pulled out the check to show her, she actually gasped. $50,000, she whispered, holding it carefully like it might disintegrate. David, this is incredible. This is life-changing. We could pay off your student loans, get a new car, maybe even put a down payment on a house. We? David said quietly. Jennifer looked at him confused. Well, yeah. I mean, we've been together 2 years. I just assumed. She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. And there it was. The first crack in what should have been a perfect moment. David realized that while Jennifer was already mentally spending the money, he hadn't even decided if he'd cash the check. They'd been dating for 2 years, sure, but he wasn't ready to think about houses and combined finances. He loved her, but this felt too fast, too presumptuous. I haven't decided what I'm doing with any of it yet, David said carefully. Jennifer set the check down on the coffee table. What do you mean you haven't decided? It's $50,000 free and clear. And the foundation job? $90,000 a year? That's almost double what you make now. But I'd have to leave design. Everything I've built, all my clients, my freelance work. To run a charity that helps people, Jennifer said, her voice rising slightly. With someone else's $2 million. David, people dream about opportunities like this. I know, David said, but it's not that simple. They talked for another hour, going in circles. Jennifer couldn't understand his hesitation. To her, it was obvious. Take the job, take the money, start a new life. But David couldn't shake the weight of it all. This wasn't just a job offer. This was Helen's dying wish. What if he failed? What if he wasn't good enough? What if he let her down? Jennifer left around 10, frustrated and confused. David didn't blame her. He was frustrated and confused too. That weekend was the longest of David's life. He barely left his apartment. He read through every single document in the folder. The foundation's mission statement, written in Helen's own handwriting. The financial reports. The resumes of the 3 staff members already hired. There was even a lease agreement for a small office space downtown. Helen had thought of everything. She'd built the entire framework and left just one piece missing. Him. Saturday afternoon, his mom called. She lived 3 hours away in Spokane and they talked every week. David found himself telling her everything, and unlike Jennifer, his mom didn't immediately tell him what to do. "That's a lot of responsibility, honey," she said thoughtfully. "What does your gut tell you?" "I don't know, Mom. Part of me wants to do it. Really wants to. But I'm terrified. What if I'm not the right person? What if I mess it all up? Let me ask you something. If money wasn't part of this at all, if Helen had just asked you to help her give away money to people who needed it, would you want to do that?" David thought about it. "Yeah, I think I would." "Then the only thing stopping you is fear. And baby, fear is okay. Fear means you care about doing it right. The question is whether you're going to let that fear make your decision for you." After he hung up, David sat with those words. Was he letting fear decide, or was he being smart and realistic about his limitations? He thought about his design career. He'd worked hard to build it, but was he passionate about it anymore? Lately it felt like the same projects over and over. Logo designs, website mock-ups, brand refreshes. Good work, steady work, but not fulfilling work. When was the last time he'd gone to bed excited about what he'd done that day? Sunday morning, David did something impulsive. He drove to the address listed for the foundation office. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know well, mixed commercial and residential. The office was on the ground floor of a renovated brick building. Through the window he could see a reception area with a desk, some chairs, filing cabinets along one wall. It looked real. Helen had made it real. A woman was inside unpacking boxes. She looked up and saw David peering through the window. She waved and came to unlock the door. "Can I help you?" she asked. She was maybe 60 with short gray hair and warm brown eyes. "I'm sorry, I was just looking. I'm David Chen." Her whole face lit up. "David, oh my goodness." "I'm Patricia. I'm supposed to be the office manager if you decide to take the position." "Helen hired me about 2 weeks before she passed." "You knew Helen?" "For 30 years. I worked with her on 3 different charitable projects. She was the best person I ever knew." Patricia's eyes got a little misty. "She talked about you constantly those last 2 weeks. She was so excited. She said you were going to be perfect for this." "She barely knew me," David said. "She knew enough. Come on, let me show you around." The office was small but well planned. 3 desks in the main area, a private office for the director, a small kitchen, a meeting room. On one wall, Patricia had already hung a large photo of Helen. She was younger in the picture, maybe in her 50s, smiling broadly with her arm around an older man who must have been Gerald. "She left you something else," Patricia said, going to the director's office. On the desk was a small box wrapped in brown paper. "She made me promise to give it to you if you came by." David opened it carefully. Inside was a parking meter coin, the old-fashioned kind that hardly existed anymore, and a note card in Helen's handwriting. "For when you need to remember that small moments can change everything. That kindness doesn't need to be grand. That you already have everything you need to do this. Trust yourself the way I trust you. With love, Helen." David felt tears on his cheeks before he even realized he was crying. Patricia put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She believed in you," Patricia said softly. "The question is, do you believe in yourself?" David drove home with the coin in his pocket. That night he called Jennifer and they had a long, honest conversation. He told her he was going to take the job. She asked if they could talk about the $50,000, about their future, about moving in together. He told her he wasn't ready for that yet, that he needed to focus on the foundation first, that he needed some time to figure things out. She didn't take it well. By the end of the call, they'd decided to take a break. Maybe it would turn into a breakup. Maybe they'd find their way back to each other. David felt sad about it, but also relieved. Sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one. Monday morning, David called Richard Sullivan. "I'll do it," he said simply. "I'll run the foundation. I want to honor Helen's trust in me." He could hear the smile in Sullivan's voice. "She'd be very proud of you, David. When can you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to finish up my current projects and tell my clients. Then I'm all yours." "Perfect. Welcome to the Westbrook Hope Foundation, Director Chen." After he hung up, David sat quietly in his apartment. His old life was ending. A new one was beginning. He was terrified and excited and sad and hopeful all at once. He pulled the parking meter coin from his pocket and turned it over in his fingers. Such a small thing. Such a small moment in the rain that Tuesday morning. But Helen was right. Small moments could change everything, and David was about to prove it. 6 months had passed since David walked into the Westbrook Hope Foundation office for his first day as director. 6 months that had been the hardest, most exhausting, most rewarding time of his entire life. He stood now in that same office, looking at the wall that Patricia had turned into what she called the Hope Board. It was covered with letters, photos, and thank you cards from people the foundation had helped. Each one represented a life changed, a crisis averted, a family kept together. There was the letter from Robert, a military veteran whose car had broken down right before he was supposed to start a new job. The foundation had paid for the repairs, $350 that meant he didn't lose the opportunity he'd worked so hard to get. He'd written to say he'd been promoted to supervisor and wanted to donate back to the foundation. There was a photo from the Martinez family. The father had been in a serious accident and couldn't work for 3 months. They were 2 weeks from being evicted when the foundation stepped in and paid their back rent. In the photo, they were standing in front of their apartment building, all 5 of them smiling. The youngest daughter was holding a sign that said, "Thank you for keeping us home." There was the card from an elderly woman named Dorothy, who'd needed emergency dental surgery but couldn't afford it. She'd been in constant pain for months, unable to eat solid food. The foundation had covered the procedure. Her card said simply, "You gave me my smile back, and my dignity." David touched each one gently as he walked along the wall. These were the moments that kept him going during the hard days. And there had been plenty of hard days. Learning to run a nonprofit had been like learning a new language. There were grant applications, financial reports, board meetings, and endless paperwork. There had been tough decisions about who to help and who they couldn't help. Those were the worst moments, when someone called desperately needing assistance and the foundation simply didn't have enough money, or their situation didn't fit the criteria. David had made mistakes. He'd approved a grant early on that turned out to be based on false information. Someone had taken advantage of his inexperience and his desire to help. That had stung. He'd felt like he'd let Helen down. But Patricia had reminded him that getting scammed once didn't mean he should stop trusting people. It meant he needed to verify better while still keeping his heart open. The foundation had helped 63 families so far. 63 situations that could have spiraled into homelessness, hunger, or worse. They'd paid medical bills, car repairs, overdue utilities, emergency travel costs, and legal fees. Each grant averaged around $15,000, though some were smaller and a few were larger. They were running through the money faster than David had expected. At this rate, the $2 million would be gone in 3 years. That had kept him up at night until Patricia suggested they start fundraising. Now David spent part of his time reaching out to local businesses, writing grant proposals to other foundations, and speaking at community events. He'd given his first public speech 2 months ago at a Rotary Club lunch. He'd been terrified, his hands shaking as he held the microphone. But then he'd told Helen's story. He'd told them about the parking ticket, the letter, the gift she'd given him. He'd shown them the parking meter coin that he now kept on his desk. By the end, half the room was crying. They'd raised $8,000 that day. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Patricia. "Young mother just called. Situation sounds urgent. Can you come back to the office?" David had been at the bank dealing with paperwork, but he immediately headed back. When he arrived, Patricia was sitting with a woman who looked barely 25. She had a baby in her arms and a toddler clinging to her leg. Her eyes were red from crying. "This is Amanda," Patricia said gently. "Amanda, this is David, our director." David sat down across from her, keeping his voice soft. "Hi, Amanda. Patricia says you need some help. Can you tell me what's going on?" Amanda's story came out in bits and pieces between tears. Her husband had left 3 weeks ago. Just packed a bag and disappeared. She'd been a stay-at-home mom, hadn't worked in 2 years. She had no money, no family nearby, no one to turn to. The rent was due in 4 days, and she was $800 short. If she got evicted, she'd have nowhere to go with her kids. "I'm not someone who asks for help," Amanda said, her voice breaking. "I've always figured things out on my own, but I don't know what to do. I've applied for jobs, but nobody will hire me when I tell them I need to bring a baby to work. Daycare costs more than I'd make anyway. I'm just trying to keep my kids safe, and I'm failing." David felt that familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt when he saw Helen crying in the rain. "You're not failing," he said firmly. "You're doing everything you can in an impossible situation. And that's exactly why we're here. Can you give Patricia your landlord's information? We'll take care of the rent, and we'll pay it for the next 3 months while you figure out your next steps." Amanda stared at him. "You'd do that?" "Just like that?" "Just like that," David said, smiling. "That's what this foundation is for. Helping people who need it when they need it most." Amanda broke down crying again, but this time with relief. She hugged David so hard he could barely breathe, thanking him over and over. When she left an hour later, her whole demeanor had changed. She was standing straighter, smiling at her kids, hope written all over her face. Patricia watched her go, then turned to David. "You're getting good at this." "I had a good teacher," David said. Helen knew what she was doing when she set this up. That evening, David stayed late at the office. It was something he did a lot now, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He was looking through applications, reading stories, trying to figure out how to help as many people as possible with the resources they had. On his desk, next to his computer, were 2 things: the parking meter coin Helen had left him, and a framed copy of the parking ticket receipt from that rainy Tuesday. He'd tracked it down in his email records and printed it out. On the back, he'd written Helen's words from her letter: "Kindness is never wasted." It echoes forward in ways we cannot imagine. His phone rang. It was his mom. "Hey, honey, just calling to check in. How are things?" "Good, Mom, really good. We helped another family today. Single mom with 2 little kids. You should have seen the look on her face when we told her we'd cover her rent." "That's beautiful, baby. Helen would be so proud of you." "I hope so," David said, looking at her photo on the wall. "I think about her every day. About that morning in the rain. How different my life would be if I just kept walking." "But you didn't keep walking," his mom said. "That's who you are. That's who you've always been." After they hung up, David sat in the quiet office thinking about the path his life had taken. Jennifer had moved out to Portland for a new job. They'd ended things amicably, both acknowledging they wanted different things. He missed her sometimes, but he didn't regret his choice. His design business was completely gone now, handed off to another freelancer he'd recommended to his old clients. Some days he missed the creative work, but mostly he didn't. This was better. This mattered more. He thought about Helen dying, choosing to spend her last days setting all this up, believing in him when she had no reason to, trusting a stranger with her final dream. 63 families helped, hundreds more on the waiting list, each one a ripple spreading out from that single moment of kindness in the rain. David pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. The $50,000 Helen had given him was still sitting there untouched. He'd been saving it, not sure what to do with it. He'd thought maybe someday he'd use it for a house or investments, or something practical. But looking at the hope board, at all those faces and stories, he knew what Helen would want him to do with it. He transferred the entire amount to the foundation's account. $50,000. Enough to help maybe 3 or 4 more families. Enough to keep Helen's dream alive a little longer. Enough to prove that kindness really does echo forward in ways we can't imagine. David locked up the office and stepped out into the evening. It was drizzling. The same kind of rain that had been falling that Tuesday morning 6 months ago. He smiled and started walking, not bothering to hurry. Somewhere out there, someone was having the worst day of their life. Someone was standing in the rain, counting coins they didn't have, feeling invisible and defeated. And tomorrow, when they called the foundation, David would be there to help. Because that's what you do when someone gives you the gift of hope. You pass it on.